Welcome to the first lecture of the Department of Architecture. I just met Annabelle Selldorf. I didn't know her before, and I am very, very pleased that she's agreed to come out tonight. Being a chair that is a historian and theorist, sometimes we have a lot of kind of verbal performances, and a student last fall said, "Michael, I really wish we could just see some real architecture." Okay, this is it, right? This is a force to be reckoned with, a real architecture. Annabelle founded Selldorf Architects in 1988 in New York. From the start, it's really interesting to watch how young firms begin. From the start, the project that most of us knew her new firm by was the Neue Galery, not the Berlin one, but the New York one. It was a gallery for German and Austrian art in New York, art and decorative arts. And it was a meticulous renovation project of historical elements, but together, and sometimes I think only architects saw this latter, together with very demanding need for complex structural system, mechanical additions, and it was bringing those two things together in a single project that I think got the attention of the architecture community of Selldorf Architects. And so that began a kind of theme that continued. Other projects like the Clark Institute, our Clark Institute, let's say in Williamstown, which Gary Hildebrandt worked with Annabelle on the landscape of that project. Again, partly restoration of galleries, partly additions, and that led to a number of art-related projects like galleries in New York. But at the same time, there emerged a completely different kind of work. And I'm polarizing is something that is not really polarized, but just to make the point of the range. But the other side of the work, which were industrial buildings and sometimes difficult industrial sites. I don't know if you agree with this kind of way of telling the story, but to me, those two worlds a little bit seemed to come together in the David Zwirner galleries, which if you didn't know the Neue Gallery, you could not know the David Zwirner gallery. It was a cast-in-place, it was also partly renovation, but with a new cast-in-place concrete facade, 5 stories in Manhattan. Cast-in-place in Manhattan, well, at least as a finish surface, it's not that easy. But it was exquisitely done. And I remember I watched a video of Annabelle talking about that gallery, and the thing that struck me is Annabelle, when you said, "We did not one thing we didn't have to do." And to me, somehow that, you could almost say that about, I think, your work generally, that there's not one thing, when you know you have it, it's when not one thing seems like that it wouldn't have to be there. And I think that's kind of the theme. Tonight, my understanding is we're going to see newer projects. The Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, which continues this theme of gallery, part renovation, part addition, although this is mostly addition. But then extremely interesting, the transformation of some former railway yards in Arles, France, into a contemporary art center. And I'm not saying the San Diego project isn't interesting, but this transformation of the rail yards is one of those moments, I think. And if that weren't enough, then Sunset Park, which is a reclamation and construction of the largest, this is true, the largest material reclamation center in the United States. I'm also very pleased to announce tonight that Annabelle will be giving an option studio in the fall, and I'm excited about that. This is a kind of rare, I think, so I'm very pleased about that. And I would end by just saying this. We talk a lot in our department and about the difficulty of the thesis project. And this is something that comes up again and again. If you're paying attention tonight, there's a design thesis and a lesson, not only a design thesis, but a lesson about how to pursue and develop a thesis in each of these projects that Annabelle will show, from the exhibit of art in well-proportioned spaces with a quality of light that has a sort of presence but still doesn't interfere with the art, to how to work with pre-engineered building components for the largest material recovery facility in the United States. Welcome, Annabelle Selldorf.
Hello, everybody. This introduction was so nice and so complete that I don't need to say anything else. It's actually true. Well, I can fill it out a little bit, and I'll repeat some things that Michael has said. Thank you. I really appreciated that. I want to tell you a little bit about Selldorf Architects and who we are today and who we were then. Today we are about 70 people. We live on Union Square in New York City. Very lucky spot this, because there is 3 times a week a farmer's market, and if clients get bored, they can go to the farmer's market. Actually, it's really very healthy living for us too, albeit expensive. But we haven't always been there at that office. It's a large space, it's a big loft space, and I love working there. When we moved there, I realized that having space to work brings people together in a completely unique way. And I look at all of those incredible, smart, young, brilliant, hardworking people in the studio. And one of the things I'm proudest of is that they come from everywhere. We have amazing diversity in the studio, and everybody offers a lot of themselves by virtue of the fact that they share where they come from. And I realized one day that I don't very much talk about where I am from. It's pretty evident, I'm afraid, that I am German, and what's so funny? But 37 years in New York haven't broken my accent yet. I tried to keep it charming. I know it's not like French, but anyway. But I did want to tell you a little bit that not only I am from Germany, I'm from Cologne. And I grew up in the 60s. My father was an architect. And if you grew up in post-war Germany, you were very familiar with pictures like this. I am not going to start telling you the story of the Second World War, but the story of utter and almost complete destruction is something that imprints itself in your memory, even if you weren't there. I don't know if you know much about epigenetics, but it seems to be one such thing. So rebuilding and kind of appreciating old substance, old buildings, old material, is something that comes almost natural to me because it's what I was raised with. And I'm showing you this picture not because I think there is such marvelous architecture around the Cologne Cathedral today, but it is by way of talking about what you see when you grow up. Cologne was extremely haphazardly rebuilt with some terrible 50s and 60s buildings, but all the same, they were modernist buildings. And that modernist tradition and the tradition in Cologne of craft and art are things that are very much in somehow part of my understanding of the world. And so one of the first projects I ever did by the time that I had become a practicing architect in New York was a gallery for a famous German art dealer, Michael Werner, in New York City. It was the first almost public space that I worked on, and I came by this project a little bit almost as a coincidence, because the art dealer who wanted this gallery said, I want everything, but I just don't want any architecture. And I thought that suited me just fine. We never met until much, much later, and he hired me over the phone and asked me the really weird questions like, how much? And I was like really not prepared for this because this was the first conversation we ever had. So I said, $10,000. And I had no idea whether that was a lot or little. Anyway, he said, yeah, okay, but I won't be available for about 6 weeks because I'm going on holiday. But I will be in New York in the middle of August, and I will come and look at the drawings with you. So he came, and I had literally spent the entire summer in my shirt at my desk, actually sometimes not with a shirt, because it was very hot. And I had produced all these drawings, and as I was producing these drawings, I all of a sudden realized, wow, I have had no conversation. Everything I'm doing is speculative. What if he doesn't like it? But it turned out that he liked what I had drawn. We immediately had a sort of interesting dialogue, and maybe the most memorable moment was when I showed him an elevation of this very door, and Michael pulled out this little crumpled piece of paper where he had drawn a door. He looked at his, and he looked at mine, and he said, yours is better. And with that, we established a relationship that lasted a long time, or he's still a very good friend of mine. But I give Michael a lot of credit for making me look at things, look at architecture, look at art, think about how art is in space. And this was the first art space I ever did. I knew a lot of artists and art dealers for some reason or another in New York, and they were my friends almost more than the sort of architectural community, because I was educated at Pratt, and Pratt was a very disparate school where people didn't necessarily hang out together all that much. And so there I was looking at art, and lucky, a little while later, I was asked to help with the renovation of what is today the Neue Galerie Museum for German and Austrian Art in New York. And I remember that I was quite busy when I received the call to go look at this building, and annoyed that I had to make time in my busy, busy day. But there I was looking at this Carrere and Hastings buildings and thinking, I'm really glad I kept the appointment. And thereafter, for some 4 or 5 years, we worked on the renovation painstaking, as Michael has already talked about. And what I learned was that thinking about space for a specific kind of art, because this was for German and Austrian art post-1945, but yes, up until to the year 2000. And so looking at an old space for modern art, as it were, was a specific idea. So we looked at the section and all the possibilities it would hold, specifically this amazing skylight in the middle that when we saw the building at first was completely covered up, and went to work understanding that despite the fact that this building wasn't landmark listed on the inside, that we wanted to keep the logic and the circulation of the building. And of course you understand why, because this magnificent staircase leads to these very grand spaces. And when I think about it today, I don't remember anymore what is new or what is old. But it is true that we took the building apart pretty much completely before putting it back together again. Now, we did nothing to that staircase, mind you, but a new state-of-the-art climate control system was inserted, a completely new lighting system is everywhere, and thinking about how to exhibit spaces, objects, furniture in decorative arts in the spaces, what kind of vitrines, where pictures would hang. This particular photo looks rather yellow. It isn't in real life, but I like looking at this photo because making this museal glass ceiling in this space turned a domestic space, a formerly domestic space, into something else. And it brings to you, if you care to think about it, the simultaneity of when this building was built in the style of a sort of French mansion, together with the time of the Vienna secession. And there is that obvious conflict and overlap and tension, if you will, that is perfectly beautiful to all of us today because we are used to looking at things in that manner. But if you think about it, all of the historic context is really rather interesting. And so, it came together that all these restoration aspects, you know, there's a brand new ceiling in here with what was then 12 years ago very progressive lighting, but also very purposeful lighting. One of the exercises, I would say, was to do just as little as you could get away with, but making it look completely normal, effortless, elegant, not over-restored, and simple. And so these vitrines, for example, were part and parcel of the original design. Not that we designed these vitrines, quite the opposite. We found them at the Museum for Decorative Arts in Vienna, and then realized that they actually came from the Victoria and Albert Museum. And so they were rebuilt, and they fit this space perfectly and make a really interesting contrast to the objects in the vitrine by Hoffmann and Wagner and other people. So the Neue Galerie was an important project for us, and it sort of almost naturally led to a series of other art-related projects. Here we're showing you a plan, a map of West Chelsea, and indicated in red, not in white, that would be too many buildings. In red are buildings and projects that we've worked on over the course of the last 10 years as West Chelsea has become a very prominent art district. And I'm only going to show you really, if I used the right thing, only one project. That building that you see there was a garage, a 3-story garage, and David Zwirner, a good friend and old client of mine, called just at the moment when I had truly nothing else to do in 2008, and said, guess what, I bought a building, and I want to build a new building that is better than a museum because I want to show my artists under ideal conditions. And nobody really knows how to do that. I know how to do that. And he didn't mean me, he meant himself. And I will give him credit because I really think he did and he does. And he has very, very specific ideas, and we've worked together on so many projects that were sort of in code language with one another. And fast forward a couple of years later, this cast-in-place structure sits discreetly, but I think powerfully on West 20th Street. And as the design developed, the idea of making a building that sits in the street wall, that communicates with the surrounding buildings that are in all likelihood going to stay in a very much changing neighborhood. So the idea of having this relationship to the neighboring buildings by utilizing punched windows and making that part and parcel of a sort of relationship in the street. But what also evolved was the idea of using cast-in-place concrete. And I often say that one of the nicest things about getting older is that you have more experience. I had no experience doing cast-in-place concrete, and I foolishly thought, well, what's the big deal? We learned, and it took some time to learn that it's just complicated. In New York City, as Michael already alluded to, you may wonder why that's complicated. It's just because the trade is very much controlled by a small group of people who have very little interest in developing technology. It's very expensive, and you're subject to basically a rigged system. But I had heard about that, like the famous concrete boots, but didn't really think that that would actually be a problem. Turned out that it wasn't a problem, but it was a lot of work. And so a little bit more about concrete later, but here about the building. It's, like I said, a 5-story building in the street, but it is shaped as in an L form, and the largest space, the heart of the matter, is right in the middle of it. And the building is L-shaped because of that large space, and because that large space wanted to have skylights. Lighting with natural daylight is something that I feel is extremely important for the viewing of art, but it is simply indispensable as far as David Zwirner is concerned. And so here is the plan that sort of very quickly indicates how this square site is organized. What's indicated in red are the exhibition spaces, and in blue is the circulation place. So I think even without studying this plan in a lot of detail, I think what you can see is how tightly it is organized, and how few elements get you through the building. It's only the ground floor and the second floor that are open to the public, but there are showrooms and offices on the floors above. And this staircase that you see to the right winds itself through the entire building, as you will see in a moment. So one of the things that was important to us was to create an interesting section. Here are the skylights, north-facing skylights that I talked about. We experimented a great deal with how to maximize daylight, how to simply never have hotspots on the floor. It's something that becomes a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. And it's very interesting and very beautiful when all the research works. There's, oops, sorry, back. It won't go back. It does go back. There are green roofs everywhere, super efficient air conditioning, natural ventilation, lots of daylight, bicycles galore, and a good staircase to walk up and down in. And so this is probably the first commercial art gallery of this size that has a LEED gold label. And that was important to David. Of course, it's important to us, but very rarely are clients willing, and especially for a commercial building, to go through the extra effort that it takes. But it made sense here because we think that sustainability has to be something that is practical, that's part of your thinking. And so I'm particularly proud that we sort of put this very simple, these simple concepts into action. But this drawing, of course, is also there to describe what that section looks like. You have a relatively thin space along the street and then wrapping around the tall space in an L shape. And so now here you see what that building looks like in the street. Obviously, it's making the street wall, but it's distinct in its materiality. And I appreciate that at different times of the day, the way the light is reflected on the concrete is really quite beautiful. And here just a couple of pictures of all the efforts we went through with the concrete. We hired a consultant who has done a lot of wonderful buildings in and around America and probably in the world, who came out of I.M. Pei's office. And his name is Reg Hoff, and he's an elderly gentleman who was just as enthusiastic about creating mock-ups and understanding color and so on as we were. And somewhere off-site, we did all of these mock-ups. We hired a different company that wasn't a union company. And we decided very quickly that we really had to define absolutely everything, like what kind of board form would we use. They were boards of a particular length. They were cedar boards. Pine boards, sorry, and they were stacked in a particular fashion so that as you look at the building, you will realize that there is a strongly articulated wood pattern on the facade, but it is very regular, and so it never feels messy, as it were. And here it is by night. Of course, in the evening, the building glows beautifully, especially on one of the first exhibitions. Oh, no, I'm meant to talk about something else here. Concrete goes on because, as this drawing shows, we wanted to demonstrate that the architecture is not just a facade, but that the building is literally a concrete building. And so we carry one architectural motif into the staircase, and that is really rather exciting because it goes very tall, and the way light is reflected in that staircase is pretty nice. It was also a strong desire to make that staircase and that concrete just as thin as possible, and we showed everybody those photographs of Le Corbusier's stair at La Tourette, and there you go. I'm not going to go on showing you more Corbusier pictures. But I am very proud that we worked with the structural engineer until finally they relented and allowed us to have a very thin stringer winding itself through the building. The large span exhibition space was, among other, designed for Richard Serra, and it was one of my proudest moments when he opened his show and he came by and he said, "Good building." It's pretty much better than anything, right? But any art looks great in this space, and by now there have been so many different exhibitions here. Stan Flavin, and I've always loved what that looks like. And here is another picture of the staircase winding itself and dropping you off on the second floor, where there is a very different kind of exhibition space that's very well suited for drawings and smaller works of art. It gets a different kind of daylighting from the side. And it is really important to me and was to David as well to say this is not just a building for public visitors, but it is a building for all of the people who work here. I think there are some 60 people who work in the building today. And finally, just a view out the window across to the Hudson River. Speaking of water, across the ocean in the south of France now, here is the project that that Michael mentioned earlier, the LUMA Arles, it's an art foundation that is dedicated to contemporary art, to experimental contemporary art, performances, music, projects of all different kinds. And long before we came onto the scene, Frank Gehry was there, and he was hired by Maya Hoffman, who is the patron of the LUMA Foundation, to build a building that would counteract the very beautiful and very tight historic center of Arles. Just to explain this a little bit further, the location of the Parc des Ateliers, right, is I think it's 6 hectares of an industrial area where the French railways at one time fabricated locomotives and repaired train cars. And all of these buildings, oops, how does it go? Here, all of these buildings are existing buildings. They're in red because those are the buildings that we're working on. But this is called the Grande Halle, and it's been there, and this building is also there. And right here is Frank Gehry's tower. It's not really, strictly speaking, a tower, but it presents itself as a rather tall building, because one of the things that is very difficult to describe in drawings is that there is a 7-meter drop between this former industrial area and the boulevard where Gehry's building is raised on top of the boulevard. And here you see these industrial buildings. They are shed buildings. They have overhead lights. They have a very simple structure, a sort of slightly classical elevation or facade system that was built at the turn of the century. And back one. And what you see again are the roofs of the 2 buildings that we have already renovated. In the far building, I'm not very good at this. In the far building, right here, you see an addition that we put onto this building, which is called the Mécanique, which serves an exhibition space to create a much larger span. And now, this is a little bit of an impression. This project is still under construction, so there is a park yet to come. Bas Mates from Brussels is the talented landscape designer who's working with all of us to create a park that is a garden park that is literally an amenity for all of the people in Arles. And that is really the grand and wonderful idea behind this project, is that the conversion of this factory that left many people without work when the factory closed is bringing a totally different purpose, a cultural center to Arles that will inspire the city, I would say, during all times of the year. Right now, Arles is a little bit deserted during the winter months, even though it's quite beautiful. But little by little, there is life in this place that that you can see here in the summertime. And I feel that the renovation that we did, is it really a renovation? Well, there was an exterior shell to these buildings, but everything else is new, was suited my idea again, doing just as little as possible, but while you were doing very little, staying busy, paying attention to everything all the time. And so even the open courtyard, the area where that is not roofed over, that is used for a cafe and people coming together, has this kind of visible structure that very carefully supports the facades. And then the stealth bomber behind. And this was sort of an interesting development as well, because it was very clear to us when we were adding this part of the building to the regular shed roofs that it had to kind of be the same shape. And it was all about creating a structure on the outside that allowed us to have column-free space on the inside, but we didn't want it to look just exactly the same. And at one time there had been a fire, so this end wall that was over here was actually just a very simple, primitive CMU unit. And so I quite liked that industrial vocabulary, and we played around with choosing different concrete units. And then somebody came along and said, well, there are those really beautiful ink black CMU units. And very quickly, the stealth bomber was born. But there are elements that you find around the south of France that bring shade to the passerby, that very much create a kind of atmosphere and a relationship with the place that I always think is very important. And this is what these spaces look like on the inside. Pretty much the same structure as it was. Skylights were rearranged to, again, keep the sun away from the walls. But overall, it just feels like it was always meant to be this way. And it's very flexible for different kinds of use, for art exhibitions. This show was designed by Philippe Rams, who I think you all know. And his idea about laying out the space was very, very different from my angular vision of the world. But I was very pleased to see that it worked just beautifully, and that different kinds of concepts are possible in the space. A picture of a building that is under construction. We're completely reconfiguring a building that is called the Formation, where we have rehearsal space and a CLT wood double-story dormitory. And that's, for me, quite fun. I don't have very good pictures to show you. This is the upstairs rehearsal space with refurbished wooden trusses and a new climate system. All very, very simple, but allowing natural ventilation when necessary, daylight if you want it, not if you don't. But the dormitory space is on the floor below and is basically a structure within a structure, 2 floors of cross-laminated timber, dormitory bedrooms on top of one another. And like I said, it's under construction, so I can't show you very much. But it's quite exciting because they're sort of very simple little spaces. Now, in a more Western direction, the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego is a project that we hope is going into construction sometime later this year. It's a museum that started with a house, really, by Irving Gill. I think it was built in 1928 or something like that. I can't remember the date. But Irving Gill is responsible for this proto-modern architecture in La Jolla that I simply love, because it's so simple and so elegant, and he talked about simplicity, sincerity, and serenity. And I always thought those were good mottos, and I'd like to pass them on as my own. But this house, when belonged to Elizabeth Scripps. You may have heard of the Scripps Institute, and the Scripps family was very instrumental in Southern California. She had this house built by Irving Gill, and would do her calisthenics out here on the balcony every morning. But when she died, she left the building to an art foundation, and it became the first art museum in La Jolla. And over time, different people added to it. Most recently, Robert Venturi did a little addition that you can see right here. He's also responsible for this space here and these rather enormous columns that cover up the Irving Gill building. And then there's a little cafe space over here. It turned out that Bob Venturi's edition did not offer the amount of gallery space the museum needed. In fact, there is no gallery space at all, except all the space that was already there in the Gill building. And so when we happily won a small competition for this project, we were tasked with maximizing gallery space. And that is what we're doing. Here is a picture from the ocean side, and I think I didn't really explain to you how incredibly spectacular this building is in terms of where it's located, because it looks out on the ocean, and competing with the Pacific Ocean is very difficult. But it became clear that you had to somehow make the views your friend and not your enemy. Simply, you wouldn't win. But also, this is a very fragile landscape. It wasn't very easy to sort of find space. We have to dig into the hill, and getting permits is extremely difficult. But in the process, what we're proposing is converting what was the auditorium into big gallery space. You see some skylights over here, and we're working out how to keep the light out of the building rather than bringing too much light into the building, because the Southern California light is intense. And so that's quite a task. But anyway, so here is the remnant of the Venturi building. This is the original Gill building, and then there is a Mosher Dreyer Architects from San Diego edition that remains in the back. In fact, I think it's quite important to sort of think of this building when it is all finished as something that has evolved to being what it is going to be. Part of the renovation is to give the building a real front entrance, which it doesn't have right now. Currently, you enter through this courtyard on the side here if you are able to make it past the columns, which we have removed here. But the new entrance is sort of a little bit more prominent along here. Like I said, the auditorium will be converted to gallery space, and then there is a connection with a bar building in a on the south side of the building, and here is a trapezoidal gallery that I think of as a garden court. And you can see in this plan, without studying it a lot, that not only are we adding a lot of gallery space, but we're also sort of marrying these very odd geometries. And as a kind of description of process, I think for the team and myself in the office, what we are working on is always circulation. Like, if you create a circulation that works well, everything else kind of falls into place if you're able to proportion spaces and sort of direct the light properly. So again, the idea is that this addition that is slightly larger than the rest of the building will feel completely natural. And there it is. The materials are stucco, and there's a little bit of travertine right here on the building, where you simply can't help but give a nod to Louis Kahn's Salk Institute. And if you've never been there, to me that was really one of the most incredible experiences the first time I went, and so since then every time when I go to San Diego I pay a little visit and have a moment of utter inspiration, I guess. Some simple images of the galleries. There is always a little connection to daylight. They have a wonderful collection of Southern California art. And what has been left in quite a mess is the rear elevation facing the ocean. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to sort of marry these very odd geometries in such a way that they become places for people to gather, that incorporate the sculpture garden in such a way that you can actually feel as if you are like climbing up the hill through the building, and I think that'll be quite nice. We've done quite a few residential buildings over the years, and just quickly I wanted to show you a house that is actually 1, 2, 3, 5 houses that we have completed this summer. That I think is one of the nicest houses I've worked on. First of all, Chilmark in Martha's Vineyard is a marvelous place, and if you've ever been, you would know that there are all these marvelous stone walls. There's a really great history of they're not even masons, because most of these are stone walls without mortar. Anyway, an artist friend of mine bought this property and said, well, what are we going to do? There was a very old house on the property that had a horrible addition to it. There was a remnant of an old barn over here, and then there were these like funny little cottages over there. And we started to play around and tried to create some relationship, and eventually we realized that on the site there was one spot that sort of felt like from there you could see everything, because this field, of course, is totally spectacular. And we proceeded to say, take the old house apart. This is the oldest house on Martha's Vineyard, I believe, and rebuild with drawings that we found in the historic archive a barn just as it was at one time. And that was really quite fun to understand how the structure went. And Guy Nordenson was the structural engineer, and he got quite excited about making a building all of wood with a solid exterior. And but the pièce de résistance is a glass house that's made entirely of wood. There is no steel in it. It's quite large, but not so large. It's sort of a glorified one-bedroom house. But because the site is so uniquely located, with literally no roads around it and this big old field that I showed you before, doing an all-glass house seemed entirely appropriate. And here, just quickly, is a plan. Obviously, no walls touching the exterior, and it's simple, but incredibly lovely. The proportions are great. You couldn't build higher than 13 feet, but that worked just beautifully for these rooms. The floor is all travertine. It was really fun to work on this house. And there it sits in the landscape. It's actually from various points. You feel that you hardly see it at all. But when you're inside, it is truly a wonderful experience of nature. Like I said, we just finished it, so we don't have that many photographs of it. But there was a very conscious idea about using a material that would deteriorate a little bit over time, like travertine does a beautiful thing when it's exposed to the elements. And that notwithstanding, there were many conversations with, like, you're not going to sue us, right, if it just cracks after the first season. I'm going to try to hurry it along. I think I brought maybe too many projects. I want to show you 2 apartment buildings that we've designed and that have recently been completed. This is number 10 Bond Street, a corner site on Lafayette Street and Bond Street. And I've looked, because I live in the neighborhood, at this parking lot for many, many years. And when the developer came to us and had finally secured the rights to build this building, we understood that we had to present this to landmarks because the neighborhood is a landmark neighborhood. And after a lot of back and forth, we built this building, which is entirely clad with terracotta, a material that I like a great deal because, for one, it's been around for a very long time. Wherever you go in the United States or anywhere, really, terracotta is a material that is malleable, that can receive a glaze, and I enjoyed playing with that because in some ways we felt that we want to build a very modern, very, very transparent building, but we wanted it to relate to the neighborhood, both in color as well as in sort of proportion, as it were. Essentially, every floor has 2 loft-like apartments with a great deal of glazing around them right here. They're very comfortable apartments. They're tall ceilings. I think they're 10'6" ceilings, open kitchens, and so on and so forth. And the reason why I'm talking about that is because a good plan is a good plan. And I take a great deal of pride in saying that everything we do emanates from a plan that includes the structure, that thinks about how you distribute your climate control. But a good plan means that you know how people move in space, what dimensions are all about, and I think it can never be said enough that the difference of an inch oftentimes is what sort of makes, well, maybe not an inch, maybe 2 inches, but understanding dimensions, both human dimensions as well as spatial dimensions, and how we move around is, I think, vital to architecture. So this photo I like a little bit because it shows you what the context is. There's obviously a relationship between the cast iron architecture to the south, and color-wise, materially, there is a relationship to buildings to the north that are red and brown brick. And it was a little bit of an adventure to use these very large pieces of terracotta, and we wanted to show you this picture because you can see how much color variation there was. Obviously, we said no to this mock-up, but it wasn't easy for the company that produces the terracotta. They're called Boston Valley, and they're located in Buffalo or Rochester, now I can't remember. But they worked very hard at getting the color of the glaze just right. And for me, it's such an immense pleasure to sort of see how the luster on the glaze works in daylight, and at different times of the day, different parts of the sort of shaped pieces catch the light differently. And then this rather lovely opportunity to create a corner window that really sort of adds a great deal of atmosphere to the apartment. Another corner condition for a building of quite similar size on Crosby Street and Broome Streets. Again, a parking lot that developers had tried to purchase for years and years and years. And finally, when we got it, we realized that too was heavily landmarked, and we had to convince Landmarks to let us build a slightly taller building than the adjacent buildings. And we played again with the vocabulary of the cast iron buildings in the district. I quite like the layered facade. It's all stainless steel with these very slender Lally columns on the outside that are not structural. And again, a two apartment per, or 2 lofts per floor layout. They're extremely luxurious, but I was happy to find that the developer allowed us to build a building that has very, very nice quality. And I think it is at once quite sophisticated, quite modern. It has exterior shading, which reduces the energy cost a great deal. And when you do exterior shading on buildings in America, they think that you've just invented the wheel. But in Europe, that's quite common. But it is very effective too, and so we played with that. Oops, sorry, one more back. Maybe we'll just keep going, because you can see the layering of the building right there. There's these little glass balconies, behind them doors that open completely, so that in nice weather you get a lot of natural ventilation. And again, I think that the play between the cast iron architecture surrounding it works very nicely for the building. And this is a rear yard where there is a lot of garden work. This is actually quite a beautiful space because it feels very intimate. And here are some views of an apartment in the building. I love these spaces because you feel that you get a very good, you're sort of part of the neighborhood. And now the Sunset Park Material Recover Facility, SIMS as we call it, is a project that's now been finished for I think 4 or 5 years. And when we applied for the commission in a small competition, we got very excited about doing something that had to do with urban infrastructure. This project is prominent and was very much on Mayor Bloomberg's mind when they assigned the site to a private-public partnership, because they wanted, this was the first of many projects following, that sort of reinvigorated the New York waterfront. It was at one time an empty pier that was dedicated to, what do you call that? Police evidence recovery. So the first time I went to the site, there were all these cars parked there, and when you went up close to them, you saw bullet holes here and there. Every once in a while, a trickle of blood, and that was pretty exciting. But you can see what a spectacular site it is. I mean, you see New York, the skyline of Manhattan over here. This is the Statue of Liberty, and what you don't see over here is a prison. And so I knew nothing about recycling, but nor did anybody else. And more often than not, these kinds of projects are handled by engineers. And we worked, of course, with an engineer, and they treated us just like little girls like to be treated. And it didn't take very long until we changed engineers. The fun part was really to think about the master planning of it. And it was in some ways a little bit prescriptive because located on a pier, the building had to work with barge deliveries. So we knew that all the cleaning of the waterway had to happen on the southern end of the pier. So barges come in here. We'll show you a little diagram of that later on. But what it meant is that the main part of the building was over here. Then the planning of the rest of the site, including this little garden area and a structure where we put education and administration together, all of that was something that we developed with an idea in mind that the buildings would function to one another in such a way that they created these courtyards, that there was a kind of promenade through the site. And despite the fact that this is not a very ceremonial place with large garbage trucks barreling down the road, it still feels like a sort of calm and organized space. And at the top end here, well, what you see is the tipping building, the processing building, and the bale building. And they function together in such a way that lots of material is dropped off here, it then is processed in here and baled and picked up again over here. And so it's a little bit of a circle. There's also a railway coming in here, cars are being weighed over there, and all this other traffic there. I could have just shown you that traffic diagram right away, but I decided to try to explain it differently. Well, railway, trucks, and then here this is civilian traffic. This roundabout is there for buses to drop off visitors because there's an education center over here. But then there is also a sort of pedestrian path along there, which I think is one of the loveliest things because you sort of look out on the water and you experience a bit of the garden. And that seems to be a little bit of an anachronism, of course, in this industrial neighborhood, but it really makes a huge difference. And the scale and the proportions of this recycling facility, of course, are rather enormous. And we realized that our usual drawing techniques weren't so good, because if you drew a building to quarter-inch scale, it would take up this entire room. So I realized that I had to sort of think about detailing a little bit differently. But after a while, you sort of understood that that it is the sort of big structural things that would have the most prominent reading in the building. It's entirely constructed with pre-engineered steel. And what we did is we turned the vertical elements outside so as to give the rhythm of the steel some expression on the outside. All of the cladding, I'll tell you about that later. Here's an image of the inside of the tipping building from the riverside, or from the water side rather, where you can see how the material is being craned into the tipping building from the barges. This is a view of the processing building, and I would like to take credit for constructing this kind of a machine, but we were only in charge of the container. It's pretty fascinating because I watched quite closely how the design of this developed, and there are very many optical sorters, and there is a great deal of safety concerns. Safety first is the lesson learned, and it used to be that in these recycling facilities there were a lot of people sorting things by hand, and that is no longer the case. But you want to be sure that people who do work there, who control the machines and who look after things, are under a very strong, very strict protocol to maintain safety. Recycling meant as many sustainable aspects to the project as possible. So there is one of the largest solar roof installations in New York available, and it's the first windmill that New York City allowed after, I think, 5 years of permitting process. They had never seen a windmill before. Just a couple of quick images showing how this works. There's many school children come every day, delivered in buses, go this path with recycled glass on the side right here. They go to the education center, and then they can go up and across a bridge to go across this bridge right here to see recycling in process. And it creates a great deal of excitement. It's quite noisy, but fun to watch, and certainly fun to watch from a safe distance. The education center itself, I think, is pretty wonderful for children and adults, because it tells you all about the evolution of materials and how they perform in the recycling process. And we always like to show these pictures of, it's all the building. The entire building is covered with a corrugated metal that's called Fabrel. It is a slightly coated and very weather-resistant corrugated material. And I love it because the way it reflects the light and sort of responds to nature is something that never ceases to amaze you. And you don't have to pay a lot of attention to the material, but truly enjoy the magnificent sky and water and weather around you. Yeah, we decided to show you all of the dramatic pictures that have come to us over time. Finally, I quickly want to show you a school that we're working on in Zambia and that we're very, very proud of. A friend of mine won a prize to deliver bicycles in Zambia, and he went there delivering bicycles, and he said, that's the wrong strategy. We should build schools, not deliver bicycles, because kids who drive on bicycles to school over long distances are in grave danger to being barreled over by truck traffic. And so he built a school and asked a friend of mine to provide the design, and they built a school that's called Chipakata. And we are building the second school, the Mabwindo School, which is some 5 miles away from the other school. And it was important to us to do it in such a way that all of the materials were readily available. The idea is that there is a big shade tent that gives you cover from the extreme sun. There is a kind of idea about developing a little community for the teacher housing over here. There's a community garden a big soccer field, and a variety of other sort of communal activities over here. Like there's a big open space in this corner. And one of the things about building the school, some 180 primary school kids come together here, is that as much as it is about education, it's also about inspiration, about fostering a communal sense, making sure that that everybody in the community is welcome here, that learning in the afternoon, that you can use the art space and the library space, and that the building of it was all done locally. So to that end, the classrooms and other spaces are all built with local bricks. We bought a brick making machine. It's a non-fired brick, and so there is education and there is creation of employment at the same time. And over here is a big mural that the artist Rashid Johnson is going to do when the building is ready. And so there is a great deal of excitement of different people coming together, and I am delighted with this. Here you see some pictures of, they sent us samples of the clay and asked us, did we like this clay or did we want them to dig someplace else for a different kind of clay? I think it's particularly fascinating that it just is from right there. And it turns out that they're doing just an exquisite job, and everybody is really excited to learn how to do this. And then the rest of the time, they play around. They play soccer, and they are very good at it. And this is really the last picture. Just to say that one of the things that keeps me off the streets these days is that we're working on a renovation and restoration of the Frick collection in New York, and I hope that you'll invite me back and I can tell you more about it. Thank you.
Allow for some questions or comments? Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
I apologize for having talked for so long.
Oh, no, we have time. So Annabelle would accept some comments or questions, but let me, if I may, start. So I knew, obviously, your work before I knew you, and when I always looked at it, I often thought of Mies van der Rohe, but I thought of Mies, what I would call his taste. And by that, I mean an acute sense of proportion, but an understanding of materials, but also of this, and I don't know how you guys do it, you designer guys, an understanding of what the material will do when it's actually in place, and maybe even after it, as you were talking about the travertine, after it weathers, after it ages. And what I mean by taste is partly that ability and partly the proportions, which I associate with often too with decorators who who curate and put materials and form in place, but they're doing it full scale. They're working more like a sculptor. They're doing it full scale, and they can see it and test it and move it around, whereas the architect can't. I was struck that, and I looked very, very closely at Mies's drawings, because Mies has a way of, it seems, representing to himself, at least, what that thing is, what it will look like when it's built. But the sketches he does don't look like the buildings. They're his way of exploring for himself. Remember when we were outside with Lisa looking at this exhibition, and I was explaining some of the some of the projects were produced. And Lisa Green referred to some of them as digital doodles. The idea being that architects now are finding digital ways of sketching that won't necessarily look like, it doesn't look like what the building looks like, but it's a way of somehow representing to yourself what the building is going to do. It's a long setup, but my question is, I was struck that your drawings, because you're presenting them to clients, so they necessarily are conventional, they're explanatory, they're very almost didactic. How do you represent to yourself? What's the process? Do you do full-scale mock-ups? Do you just, is it all in your head? How do you represent to yourself what that corner window is going to be, what the light coming off the water and hitting the corrugated facade, and this, how do you calculate the way water, sky, and corrugation is going to behave at 4:30 in the afternoon, right? I mean, I just don't know how you get there from the drawings that you showed.
It's a nice question. First of all, I relate very much to what you say about Mies van der Rohe, because I think in a funny way his drawings were something I could understand. Mm-hmm. I always sort of felt a kinship, like, yeah, I get this, I know what he's doing. And one doesn't have that with every architect. I am far from being so conceited as to compare myself to Mies, but he does come from a similar area as I do, and he did have a similarly wicked sense of humor. But I truly mean that. I think that the thing that I've always admired about Mies is that in his work there is a sort of humanist quality that is predicated on understanding where we come from and where we've been and how we've sat in chairs. And when you look at his house in Brno, so much of it has to do with how it's furnished. And it's this radical, amazing house that does so many different things. It's an experience of modern architecture in the best way that I can think of. But what I was trying to say is that the way he does these drawings, they are a way of doing this for himself, to create a narrative, to let your pen sort of say, and then you sit here, and then you do that. One doesn't have that with every architect. I don't think everybody relates to Mies the way I do, and I don't know where that comes from. I look at Korb's drawings, and they are fascinating, they're beautiful, they're incredible. But they're somebody else's drawings, and they're somebody else's thought process. And so our process is very much how we think in drawings, and I would say that I lead that process, but it is one that we all engage in, and something gets started and then somebody else thinks about it and we come back. It's a sort of iterative process. I can only draw with a pencil, I cannot draw with a computer, and I think I was very smart in not learning that, because one day it'll be so simple that I will have saved myself all that time in learning how to draw. But it is actually, in a funny way, useful, because it puts me in the role of a different kind of communicator, and it supports that iterative process of sketching over things and saying, well, we're thinking about this, which is really very, very rough, and then it gets refined, and then it goes back and forth and back and forth, and it forces you to talk to each other within the office. But you asked about how we deal with clients, and I think that too, in a way, I like the idea that the process is a little bit fluid. We come prepared with things and ideas, but we make meetings, turn meetings into workshops, because I think that you have to hear where people come from and what they want and how they work, and so it provides the fluidity.
Are there questions or comments? I have we just wait for the mic.
Your expansion in San Diego, I'd never thought about how silly the entrance Venturi designed was until I saw what you were doing, because it was a ridiculous entrance. What's going to happen to the Axline Court? Because that used to be the lobby. What that was the. What are you going to do there, or what will happen?
I've thought about that very hard. It's a very complicated thing because it was only the entrance, and so it wasn't very useful to look at art in that place because there are these giant columns inside. It's not even very good to receive people because if you do a little talk, then people always have to go like that. So after a lot of deliberation and a real commitment to making sure that it stays. I don't like Axline Court. I don't think it's a great piece of architecture, but it is part and parcel of a history and an evolution of this institution. And I respect it. I respect a lot of the thinking that went on in the course of the design. But I want to give it purpose, and I think that making it a place of an educational space could be a very, very good solution. I sort of want this to be somewhat flexible, but I think there is reason to think that people would use tables that can even, be designed by local people. I want to activate that place and use it in such a way that maybe sort of digital information sort of flows into that, and that is flexible enough so that different kinds of lectures can take place sort of like right in the middle. We've done a whole bunch of drawings, and I'm actually really excited that maybe for the first time it'll really come to much, much better use.
Wonderful. And the garden in the back with the Gabriela Roscoe and the Ruche, is that staying or?
Yes, that's staying.
Okay.
That's staying.
Thank you.
Time for drinks.
Time for drinks. Okay, fair enough. Thank you, Annabelle. We look forward to the fall.
Thank you. Again.